So in this, which is our Wonky bass demo, we're going to use a couple different synths, a couple audio effects, and a looping envelope to create this sound. So, lots going on there, and it's a super fun tone, very current sounding, and it shows off how you can use an envelope like an LFO, but in a slightly different manner. So let's get into it. So for this Wonky bass sound, we're going to work mainly within Massive. So I'm just going to pull in an instance of Massive here, and we'll start doing some typical kind of setup with our initialization patch here. I'm going to put it over to monophonic, and I'm going to adjust the amp envelope here, which is our very typical on-off envelope that we have been working with most of the time. For our oscillator section, I want to use a fairly broad spectrum of oscillators here, so I'm just going to put one down an octave and one up an octave, and then I don't actually want to have too much from either one of those, but this main centered oscillator here, I want to be the dominant oscillator within our signal path. I'm going to put all of them over to filter 1 because we're going to be doing some interesting filter routings here. And I'm going to add a little bit of white noise going to filter 1. So let's just hear what that sounds like just to start us off here. I'm going to roll down the output a tiny little bit because we're going to end up adding a fair amount of distortion and stuff within the synthesizer here. So let's just hear that again. So fairly broad tone there, and a great spot to start off with for this. So for our filter section here, what we're going to do is we're going to put it into series, but we're going to leave the mix at 50-50. And what that's going to mean is that our oscillator section is going to be sending everything to filter 1, and we're going to be listening to filter 1's output here. But filter 1 is also going to send its output to filter 2, which we're also going to be listening to. So it's going to give us the ability to take filter 1's output and listen to it raw, and also to listen to it processed by a secondary filter, which is going to give us the ability to add a little bit more grit from filter 1's output. I'm going to want to use a comb filter here. So I'm just going to dial one up. Comb filters are a great source of really cool kind of vowel-y tones and shimmery tones, and they're very good for bass tones. So let's start playing with a couple settings here. And you can hear that coming alive right there. Bring the damping up a little bit. So that's a nice kind of squealy tone there. And for my second filter, I actually want to choose a band pass because we're just going to be after a little bit of grit that's going to exist in the top end here. So I'm going to bring the cutoff a little bit up and the bandwidth up a little bit and the resonance up a little bit. And let's just flip over to filter 2 soloed here so that we can hear just what we're working with. Okay, that sounds nice. And we'll listen to filter 1 soloed. Cool. And now we're going to listen to filter 2, and I'm going to modulate the pitch of the filter that's feeding into filter 2. So you can hear that little extra bit of kind of nasal grit that we're getting on the output of filter 1 here as it's getting processed by filter 2. Now let's listen to them together again. Awesome. That's a great starting point. So I'm going to take the pattern that I've got in live here. It's a very simple MIDI pattern. I'll just solo it and let you hear it. And I'll let you hear it in conjunction with the drums. And we're going to start animating that tone a bit. Let me just bring the pitch up on this comb filter. Okay, I like that a bit more. That's a good starting point now. So most of the motion in this sound is actually going to come from envelope 2 here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign it to the comb filter with a little bit of positive motion there. And I'm now going to take the loop here, which is the sustain loop, and I'm going to flip it into infinite mode. I'm going to go all the way up. The default in Massive is that it's off. If you add in one instance of it, it will loop through this sustain loop and then go to the release phase. 2 instances allows this envelope to go through its attack and decay, loop the sustain phase twice, and then go to release, and so on all the way up. But I want it to be an infinite loop. That way when we hold down the key, it will just keep on playing the sustain phase over and over until we release the key. So I'm also going to eliminate a couple other aspects of this envelope. I'm going to bring the decay all the way down. I'm going to raise its level up. So the decay's time is down, the attack time and attack level are down. So now we've got almost our typical on-off envelope here. So now when we listen to this, we're going to have probably very little to no effect because this envelope is just going to loop continually over. And so it's going to be at its maximum applied value according to our mapping to the pitch right here. But I'm going to start playing with the levels of the decay phase and the sustain phase until we can hear a bit of a morphing sound. So, as you can hear, when I bring the sustain loop in and make it shorter, it speeds up, similar to an LFO rising in pitch. And obviously, if I bring the decay level up and the sustain level down, we'll get a downwards sawtooth style sound. Okay, so I'm also going to take envelope 2 here and apply it to the cutoff on the bandpass just a little bit so we can get a little bit more motion. There, that's balancing out better. Okay, so that's a nice little initialization here for our sustain loop. Now, one of the nice things within Massive is that you have this ability to morph between different preset sustain loops. So right now I've got linear, which is sustain loop 1. There's triangle, there's the exponential. There's also a bunch of crazy ones like steps. Steps feels a little bit like sample and hold applied to white noise, if you remember us talking about the way in which a sample and hold signal will sample random voltage values off of a white noise output. But we're going to stick with some more kind of vanilla ones here. So I'm going to start with linear, and then I'm going to go and we'll try one of the curves here. Curve 17 is a nice one. We're going to listen to both of those, actually. Let's listen to one, the linear one. And we'll listen to 17, which is curves. Okay. So, the nice thing with Massive is it gives you the ability to blend between these two sustain loop presets here. So we're going to be able to take one of our macro controls here, and we're going to apply it all the way to the morph knob. So all the way down at 0 here is just going to be the linear one, and all the way up at the top value is going to be the curves preset that I've chosen here. So let's just have a listen to that morphing happening. So let's take that macro knob, and we're also going to apply it to the sustain loop. So as the value of the knob goes up, it's going to morph between this first sustain loop phase, the linear, and the curve, which is number 17 here. And it's also going to increase the speed with which this is playing back. because the sustain loop is actually going to shorten its duration. So. Okay, I'm liking the sound of that. Now, let's just quickly, for the sake of argument here, reverse that. So we're going to have an increasing curve, not a decreasing curve. Okay, I think I actually prefer that. So at this point, you may be asking, why use an envelope when we could be using an LFO? Because the effect that we're getting is very similar. And the reason why is that an envelope still has its attack and decay phase to work with. And so you can get an extra aspect of modulation to it. When I bring the attack phase up again and add some attack, we're now going to get a little bit of a wompy rise at the start of the envelope trigger before it proceeds on to the looping sustain phase. And that's not something that we can do with an LFO. So let's just have a quick listen to that. And I'll speed up the sustain loop here. Now that I've added that, I think I'm actually going to switch the polarity around here. Yeah. And I might have it go a little bit faster. Okay, so that's sounding good, and let's start adding a couple effects here. So, to begin with, I'm going to try and add a little bit of grit to the output of filter 2. So I'm going to dial up, let's start with the sample and hold, and I'm going to go to the routing and make sure that sample and hold, which is insert 1 here, is going to the output of filter 2 only. I'm going to bring it up to a wet dry, about 50%, and then I'm going to go back to envelope 2, and I'm going to apply that to the pitch. So let's just have a quick listen to filter 2's output only. You can hear it getting degraded nicely here. Now I'm going to apply a little bit of that envelope to the pitch of the sample and hold. So I'm going to dial it back to a little bit more of the dry signal, and I think that's going to do it nicely for that. Let's listen 50-50 again. Cool. So now I'm going to add a little bit of distortion to the overall out. We'll go for the classic tube here and bring the drive down a little bit. I'm going to bring a little bit of the wet signal in. And I'm also going to drop the volume a little bit more. Okay. I want a little bit more in the highs here. Okay. And I'm going to add a little bit of delay. But I'm going to pull the times right in and only add a little bit of the wet signal. I feel like maybe we get a little bit more white noise going in. Gonna bring the color up. Okay, that's nice and gritty. And now let's have a look at insert 2. I'm going to take insert 2 and I'm going to put it on filter 1's output. And we're going to add, again, a little bit of distortion. I'm going to do it with the sine shaper here. Not a lot, just a little bit more grit. So that's sounding nice, and I think it's about time that we have a listen to this within the context of our tune that we're working with here. Okay, that is awesome. I'm going to add a little bit of glide here just to get a little bit more fluid motion. So now I'm going to go ahead and start playing around with this macro that I've set up. So now that I've got it mapped to the mod wheel of my controller, I can start playing and we can hear some pretty fun animations here. So let's just listen to it soloed. So one thing that I really like to do is once I've got something mapped to a control surface and I'm listening to it within the context of a tune, I'll go back and actually adjust some of the values that I have that macro mapped to. I tend to like working with absolute values, as in a 0 or a full amount. And so the full amount I want to be as fast as it's going to go, and I want to be able to just slam up to that within the context of the tune that I'm working on. So I want this to go a little bit faster. And we'll have a listen again. Yeah, that's better. And let's have a listen to this within the tune again. Okay, I'm really liking how that sounds. So I don't feel like we need to process this a heck of a lot. A good sound straight out the synth's output, I generally feel doesn't need a massive amount of processing. But what I am going to do is try and beef up the sub a little bit. So I'm just going to put massive into an instrument rack here. And I'm going to rename this as Wonky bass. And then I'm going to take an instance of operator, which is great as just a utility sub. I'm going to balance it underneath, and let's just have a quick listen here. And I'm just going to make sure it's set to monophonic as well. I've got a little bit of glide on the instance of massive, but not a huge amount, so I'm not really too worried about making sure that there's a glide time that corresponds here. But I am going to solo this and just have a listen to how these two balance out. So operator's really thickening that up already. Let's just bring that out of the mix and we'll bring it back in. Yeah, I'm liking what that's doing. But I do want to make sure that I'm clearing a little bit of room for it. So I'm going to take massive and EQ a little bit of the low end out. So let's listen to that without the EQ on. And with. So I'm going to take a compressor, just put it on the output here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of compression. I'm going to do RMS with fairly long attack. We'll go for about 3 milliseconds here, so there's a little bit of a transient hit. And I'm going to do a relatively gentle ratio, a little bit of a knee here, and pull the threshold down. So that's just going to tickle it a little bit and just allow for some smoothing overall in that pattern. So I'm also going to take the output of operator here, and I'm going to put a utility on it and just reduce the stereo width to 0, just so I can be sure it is a completely mono patch right up the middle. And I'm also going to add a little bit of a spatial effect to Massive's output. I'm going to do it after the EQ. And I'm just going to use a simple delay. And I'm going to bring the wet dry down so I can hear what I'm working with here. I'm going to put it into time mode and reduce the delays a lot. A tiny bit more on one channel than the other. So we'll go, say, 1.1 and 1 millisecond. And let's just have a listen to how this sounds. So you can hear there's a nice phasing element happening there. And I'm actually going to put that into an audio effect rack because I'm going to EQ the output of this simple delay as well. So I'm going to take the delay chain here, call it delay. I can add a second chain, which is just going to be dry, and there's not going to be any effect on that. And I'm going to add my EQ8 to the output of the delay. And I'm going to make sure that I'm not getting much interference in the lows there. So I'm just going to kind of try an arbitrary amount, and we'll go from there. We're going to flip the delay all the way over to wet now, because it's just providing the delayed signal, which is going to go over top of our dry track, and I'm going to roll it down in the mix a little. So I'm just going to roll down the outputs a little bit here. And we're going to have a listen to this in context with the track. But this time I'm actually going to play with the mod wheel, which is mapped to macro 1 in Massive, which is controlling the sustain loop time and the morphing amount between the morph presets there. So. So that sounds great. So that is one of the uses of looping envelopes. We're taking the sustain phase of an envelope in Massive, and we're using it to control a few different aspects of the filter cutoffs, and we're also controlling various aspects of that envelope with a macro, which is mapped to our mod wheel. So it's a very expressive facet of sound design, and it allows you to really exploit some different aspects of modulation, very different from an LFO, but can be used in a similar fashion. Is great for bass sound design and pads, etc.